9, said the storekeeper, and he set the word down on the counter like a coin he expected someone to argue over. Grace Calloway did not look up from the bolt of muslin she was measuring. She kept her fingers moving along the cloth, counting inches the way another woman might count grievances, and she said nothing at all. She had learned, in the 2 years since Edwin died, that silence was the most economical response to most things people said. It cost her nothing, and it usually ended the conversation faster than any words she might choose. 9 men, the storekeeper, Orvis Phelps, continued, because silence had never once ended a conversation for him. 9 men who came to inquire, and you turned every last one of them away. People are starting to wonder, Grace. She set down the muslin and looked at him then. People, she said, are welcome to wonder about something else. She counted out the coins for the cloth and tucked the folded yardage under her arm and walked out of Phelps Mercantile into the bright September dust of Harlan Creek, Wyoming, which in the autumn of 1883 was a town that had opinions about widows and made no effort to conceal them. The street smelled of horse and sawdust and something faintly sweet from the bakery 2 doors down. Grace paused on the boardwalk and let the sun sit on her face for a moment, because it was still warm enough to matter, and warmth was not something she had ever been able to afford to waste. From behind her she could hear the storekeeper still talking, probably to his wife through the curtain that separated the front counter from their private rooms. She did not listen. She had 4 miles to walk back to the homestead, a pile of fence posts that needed setting before the ground froze hard, and a son who would be returning from the schoolhouse in 3 hours expecting supper. The 9 men Orvis Phelps was so concerned about had nothing to do with any of that. They never had. She pulled her shawl tighter and began to walk. The road north out of Harlan Creek ran alongside a dry creek bed before it climbed toward the foothills where her land sat. 32 acres Edwin had believed in, more sincerely than he had believed in almost anything else. He had worked it until he could not stand, and when he could not stand any longer, he had died in the late spring rains with the smell of turned earth on his hands and a list of things still undone that Grace had been working through ever since. The fence posts were item 7. She was not yet certain what item 8 would be, but she suspected it involved the roof above the sleeping loft, which had begun to speak to her in a particular way during last month's rain. She was halfway to the fork in the road when she heard the horse. It came from behind her, moving at a walk, not a hurry, and she stepped to the side of the road without turning. A great many people traveled this road. It did not have to be anything to do with her. But the horse slowed when it reached her, and a voice came down from somewhere above her left shoulder, quiet and without performance. "Ma'am, would you happen to know the way to the Calloway homestead?" She turned then. The man on the horse was perhaps 35, perhaps a few years older than that, with a lean and serious face and dust on everything he wore that suggested he had been traveling at least 2 days without stopping long enough to shake out his coat. He held the reins loosely in one hand. He was not handsome in any way she would have had to warn herself about, which she noted with a kind of practical relief. "I would," she said. "Who's asking?" "Reuben Holt," he said. "I wrote a letter about 3 weeks back." Grace looked at him steadily. She had received 7 letters in the past 4 months, from 7 different men responding to the notice she had placed in the Cheyenne paper, a notice that had been strictly factual: 32 acres, existing structures, 1 child age 7, labor required, arrangement to be discussed. She had refused 5 of those men by letter and turned away 2 more in person. She had not responded to Reuben Holt's letter because it had arrived the same week the fence posts became urgent, and she had set it aside and then forgotten where she set it. "You didn't wait for an answer," she said. "No, ma'am," he said, "but I'd like to speak with you, if you'll allow it. I won't take much of your time." She considered him for a moment longer. He sat his horse with the particular stillness of a man who was accustomed to waiting and did not resent it. He had not smiled at her the way the others had smiled, the compensating smile of a man trying to make himself seem less of what he actually was. He had simply asked. "The homestead is another 2 miles, she said. "You can walk your horse." He stepped down without a word, and they walked north together through the afternoon dust, and Grace Calloway noted that he matched his pace to hers without being told, which was not something she had ever had to teach Edwin to do, but which she had noticed, in particular, that she had not needed to teach. He did not speak first. She gave him until the fork in the road, and when they turned east and the foothills opened up ahead of them, she said, "Tell me what you can do." He told her. He had worked 3 different cattle operations in the past 8 years, 2 in Colorado and 1 in New Mexico, and before that he had spent 4 years working timber in Oregon, which meant he knew how to fell and haul and dress lumber, and how to set a roof. He could shoe a horse, pull a tooth from one if needed, read well enough to keep accounts, and he had some rough experience with a plow, though he would not call himself a farmer. He said all of this plainly, without elaboration, as a man recites the contents of a supply list, and when he had finished, he said, "I am not a drinker." "That seems worth saying." "It is," Grace said. They walked another 100 yards in silence. Then he said, "Your boy, how old?" She had not expected that. The question arrived before all the others she had been waiting for. The questions about the land, about what she was offering in return, about the terms of whatever arrangement she meant to propose, and it arrived without maneuvering. He had simply asked about Thomas first. She looked at him sidelong. "7, she said. "His name is Thomas. He goes to school in town." Reuben Holt nodded once, as though this information settled something for him. "Is he well?" "He is," she said. And then, because she had not said this to anyone in so long that it surprised her coming out, "He is a very good boy." "Good," Reuben said, and that was all. The homestead came into view 20 minutes later, and Grace watched Reuben take it in without comment. She knew what it looked like. The main cabin was sound but plain. The barn needed siding on the eastern face. The kitchen garden was orderly because she had made it orderly, and the fencing along the north pasture was the particular kind of fallen down that announced a woman working alone and outrunning her own capacity. She had stopped being ashamed of it around the same time she had stopped being ashamed of asking for help. "The fence posts are the most pressing thing," she said. "I can see that," Reuben said. She pushed open the cabin door and set the muslin on the table and turned to face him in the doorway. "I'll make coffee," she said, "and then we'll discuss the terms." The terms she set out were specific and unmysterious. Reuben Holt would work the homestead, fence, roof, barn, field, whatever the season required, in exchange for room and board and a fair wage when the land produced enough to pay one. If at the end of 1 year the arrangement suited them both, they would discuss a longer contract. She was not yet willing to speak of anything beyond a contract. She said that plainly. He sat across the table from her with both hands wrapped around the coffee cup and listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "That's fair." "I have one condition that isn't in any of the letters I wrote," Grace said. "All right. Thomas doesn't know about the letters or the notice. He knows his father is gone, and he knows we need help, and he knows I've been managing, but I haven't told him I've been looking. I'd like him to meet you as a man who came to work, not as a candidate." Reuben was quiet for a moment. "You're protecting him," he said. "I am." "That makes sense." He turned the cup once in his hands. "What does he like?" "The boy." It was the second time he had asked about Thomas before asking anything about himself, and something in Grace's chest shifted very slightly, the way a door shifts when someone opens a window across the room. She had not been prepared for that. "He likes birds," she said. He draws them in the margins of his lessons. He is also partial to molasses, if there's any in the house, which there usually isn't. Reuben looked at her, and for the first time something that was almost a smile moved across his face. "I'll remember that," he said. Thomas came home from school at 3:30, banging through the door with his coat already half off and his school book tucked under one arm, and a feather he had found on the road, a meadowlark's tail feather, cream and brown, which he presented to his mother immediately and with great ceremony. Then he saw Reuben sitting at the table and stopped. "Thomas," Grace said, steady and easy, "this is Mr. Holt. He's going to be helping out around the place for a while." Thomas studied Reuben with the direct, evaluating look that 7-year-old boys have not yet learned to disguise. Reuben met it without flinching, and without the overbright cheerfulness that Grace had watched grown men deploy around children, and that children always saw through immediately. "Do you know what kind of bird that feather's from?" Reuben said. Thomas looked down at the feather in his hand. "Meadowlark," he said with some dignity. "Western meadowlark," Reuben said. "You can tell by the pattern on the outer vein. There's an eastern variety, but they don't come this far." Thomas looked up at him with an expression Grace had seen before, the expression of a child encountering an adult who is actually paying attention. "How do you know that?" he said. "I've been a lot of places," Reuben said. "You pick things up." Thomas moved to the table and set his school book down and examined Reuben a moment longer. "Are you staying for supper?" he said. "If your mother says so." Thomas turned to Grace. "Can he?" "He can," Grace said. October came in cold and purposeful, and Reuben Holt worked like a man with something to prove to no one but himself, which Grace found to be the most reliable kind of work. He set the fence posts in 6 days, all 43 of them, working from first light until the cold drove him to stop, and then starting again the next morning without being reminded. He moved into the small room off the barn that Edwin had used for storing tack, and he made it livable without making it comfortable, as though comfort were something he had not yet decided he was entitled to. Grace brought him an extra blanket the 3rd night, and left it folded on the barrel outside the door without comment, and in the morning the barrel was empty. He did not speak much unless spoken to, which suited Grace, who had spent 2 years learning the particular relief of a quiet house after Edwin's long silences had stopped being peaceful and started being the kind of silence that meant something was wrong. Reuben's silences were different. They were the silences of a man working through something in his own mind, not the silences of a man withholding. She did not ask the difference. She simply noted it. Thomas noted other things. He began appearing at the fence line while Reuben was working, sitting on the top rail or crouched in the grass with a stick, drawing the meadowlarks that came to investigate the disturbed earth. Reuben would work near him and say occasional things about the birds, unprompted, the way a man talks who has decided that what a child is interested in is worth being interested in. Grace watched this from the kitchen garden and said nothing. She had resolved not to be moved by it, because she had also resolved not to make decisions about Reuben Holt until she had seen him through at least one hard thing. The hard thing came in early November, when the temperatures dropped without warning and the water barrel froze solid 3 nights running, and the mare, old Bessie, developed a limp that Grace feared was serious. She told Reuben about it in the morning without dressing it up, and he went to look at the mare and came back and said it was the left fore, probably a bruised sole from the rocky ground, not the joint, and that she needed rest and dry footing, and he'd keep her inside until it cleared. He moved the mare into the barn's main bay and slept in the tack room himself, and checked on her twice through the night. And in the morning he came to the cabin door before breakfast to report that she had weight on the foot and was eating well and would be fine. Grace poured him coffee and did not say that she had been awake most of the night worrying, because she did not need to say it. He seemed to understand. He sat at the table and drank the coffee and said, The roof above the loft. You're going to need that seen to before the first heavy snow." "I know it," she said. "I can have it done in a week if the weather holds." "I know it," she said again, and then, because something about the quiet competence of the past month had loosened something she had kept in reserve, "Thank you, Reuben." He looked at her across the coffee cup, and there was a steadiness in it that she recognized, though she could not immediately have said from where. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "This is what I said I'd do." "People say a great many things," Grace said. Something moved in his expression then, briefly. "Yes," he said, "they do." She did not ask what he meant by that. She would learn, in time, that Reuben Holt had been married once before, briefly, to a woman who had left for California, with a man who had made larger promises, and that he had spent 2 years afterwards deciding what he believed about himself and coming, eventually, to a conclusion that was quiet, and not entirely without sorrow, but that he could live with. She would not learn this from him directly. She would learn it from a single sentence he said to Thomas one evening when Thomas asked him where he came from, and Reuben said, "I came from a place that didn't quite fit, and I've been looking for a place that might." Thomas had looked at his mother when Reuben said that, with the clear-eyed certainty of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to be careful about hope. November grew teeth. The wind off the foothills came down sharp and relentless, and the cabin held its heat stubbornly, and Grace found herself cooking larger amounts of food than she strictly needed to cook, which she told herself was economy and not anything else. She made a venison stew that lasted 3 days and a pan of cornbread that Reuben ate 2 pieces of without being pressed, and she put molasses on the table when Thomas was eating and noted that Reuben used it too, quietly, as though he hadn't been certain he was allowed to. She built a second chair. This requires explaining. There had always been 2 chairs at Grace's table, hers and Edwin's, and after Edwin died, she had sold the second one to a family in town because she could not abide looking at an empty chair. She and Thomas had been eating at a table with 1 chair and 1 3-legged stool ever since. When Reuben arrived, she had given him the stool without comment, because a stool was not a chair and a chair meant something she had not yet decided to offer. One Sunday in mid-November, she spent the afternoon in the barn with Edwin's tools and a length of walnut she had been keeping for no reason she could articulate, and she built a chair. It took most of the daylight hours, and the result was plain and without flourish, but it was solid, and the legs were plumb, and when she set it at the table it sat without rocking. She did not announce it or make any ceremony about it. She simply moved the stool to the corner and set the new chair in its place. Reuben sat in it for supper and did not say anything about it for a long time. After Thomas had gone to bed and Grace was clearing the table, he said, "You made this today." "I did," she said. He was quiet a moment. "It's well made," he said. "My father was a carpenter," she said. I paid attention. He ran his hand along the arm of the chair once, the kind of unhurried gesture a person makes when they want to understand a thing by touch. "Grace," he said, and then stopped. "Yes," she said, not answering a question, simply acknowledging the word. He did not finish the sentence that night, but the chair stayed at the table, and they both knew what it meant, even if neither of them had yet said it out loud. The trouble came from Harlan Creek in the form of Orvis Phelps's cousin, a man named Garrett Phelps who had been trying to acquire the Callaway North pasture for 2 years, and who arrived one December morning with a folded paper in his hand and a composed look that Grace distrusted on sight. He said the paper was a lien. He said Edwin had borrowed money from a land company operating out of Cheyenne, and that the note had been called in, and that the North pasture was now effectively forfeit unless she could produce the full amount by February 1st. He said all of this with the particular sympathy of a man who had practiced it in a mirror, and he told her he would be willing, out of neighborly generosity, to purchase the land outright at a fair price, so she would not have the trouble of dealing with the company directly. Grace read the paper twice. Then she looked at Garrett Phelps and said, "How much did they pay you to bring this to me?" His composure slipped, just enough. "I beg your pardon? I'm asking what your fee is from the land company," she said, "because a man doesn't ride 4 miles in a December cold out of neighborly feeling. He rides it because there's something in it for him." Reuben had come from the barn at the sound of the horse, and he stood now in the doorway behind her. He did not push past her or speak over her. He stood and let her handle her business, which is what she was doing, and Grace was deeply aware of this without turning to look at him. Garrett Phelps straightened and reassembled his composure and said the lien was perfectly legal and the offer was fair, and she ought to think carefully before refusing a generous settlement. "I will think carefully," Grace said. "I'll also be writing to the county clerk and the land office in Cheyenne, because Edwin was meticulous with his accounts, and I have never heard this company's name in connection with this land. You'll hear from me when I've finished thinking." She stepped back and closed the door. She stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment with the paper in her hand and her heart moving faster than she wanted it to. Reuben said from behind her, "May I see it?" She handed him the paper. He read it slowly, turning it once to read the reverse side, and then he said, "This isn't signed by the land company. It's signed by a notary in Cheyenne and a man named R. Aldis. I've seen lien papers before. They're usually signed by a company principal. So it may not be legal," Grace said. "It may not be binding," Reuben said, "which is different but useful. You'll want to take it to someone in Cheyenne who knows land law." "That's 3 days' travel," Grace said. "Yes," he said, "I'll go." She looked at him. "This is not part of the contract." "No," he said. "But neither was the mare's foot, and neither was the roof, and neither are most things that actually matter." He folded the paper carefully and set it on the table. "I'll go to Cheyenne. I can take the stage from town Wednesday morning. I'll be back by Saturday if there are no delays." Grace stood in the light from the window and looked at the paper on the table and thought about what it meant that she was no longer calculating, in this moment, whether to trust him. The calculation had stopped sometime in November, and she had not noticed exactly when. "All right," she said. "He left Wednesday morning, and the days he was gone were the kind of days that clarify things. The cabin was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in October, when she had been alone with Thomas, and the quiet was simply quiet. Now the quiet had a shape, which was the shape of the chair at the table and the footprints in the yard, and the particular smell of wood smoke that was slightly different when someone else had built the fire. Thomas asked twice when Reuben was coming back. Grace said Saturday, and both times Thomas accepted this and went back to his drawing, and Grace told herself that what she was feeling was the reasonable anxiety of a woman whose land question was being handled by someone who might or might not succeed. She spent Thursday and Friday cleaning the cabin with the particular energy of a woman who is not sure what else to do with her hands. Reuben came back Saturday afternoon, as he had said. He stepped off the stage in town and walked the 4 miles rather than hiring a horse, which she did not know until he told her, and he came through the kitchen door with his coat still dusty and a folded envelope in his inside pocket, and set it on the table without preamble. "The lien is fraudulent," he said. "The company dissolved in 1880. R. Aldis was their last notary, and he's been selling forged documents to land speculators for at least 3 years. The county clerk in Cheyenne is already aware of him. Your title is clean." Grace sat down. She had not meant to sit down. She had been standing at the stove, and her legs simply made the decision without consulting her, and she sat in her chair at the table and looked at the envelope and felt something large and long-held begin, very slowly, to release. "Thomas," she said. Though Thomas was outside, she said it to say something. Then she said, "Thank you, Reuben." He sat down in his chair, the walnut chair she had built, and said nothing for a moment. The stove ticked with the heat. Outside, Thomas's voice came thin and bright through the window as he talked to the chickens in the yard, which was something he did regularly and without embarrassment. Reuben said, "Grace, I want to say something." "Say it," she said. "When I came here, I came because the terms were fair and the work was honest, and I needed both of those things." He looked at his hands on the table, then at her. "But that's not why I stayed." "Why did you stay?" she said. "Because of the chair," he said. "And because of the way you talked about Thomas, and because—" He stopped, started again. "Because you said the boy eats first. The first week I was here, you said it. I'd asked whether to wait for you to sit before I ate, and you said the boy eats first, and then the rest of us. And I thought, that is someone who knows what matters. The boy eats first." She had said it in passing, a practical thing, a household rule with no poetry intended. She had not known anyone was building a feeling around it. "I'm not the man I was before," Reuben said. "I won't tell you the whole of it tonight unless you want to hear it, but I want you to know that I've made my calculations too, the same way you have, and I'm not asking to change the terms of what we agreed, because I want more than what I agreed to. I'm asking because the thing we agreed to has already changed, whether we said so or not, and I'd rather say so." Grace looked at him across the table in the thin December light. She was not a woman who moved in haste toward anything she valued, because everything she had ever lost had been lost faster than she had been prepared for, and caution had kept her standing when grief had tried its best to put her down. But she had also spent 9 months building something with this man. Fence posts and a roof and a chair and 3,000 mornings and evenings. And she was old enough to know that love built from the ground up, with both hands and in plain sight, was the kind that lasted. "Yes," she said, "I'd say so too." They were married in January by the deacon of the Harlan Creek Church, a quiet man named Whitfield who did not ask unnecessary questions and who afterward shook Reuben's hand and patted Grace's arm and told Thomas that a meadowlark he had seen on the road that morning was a very good sign, which Thomas received as the gospel truth and repeated to anyone who would listen for weeks afterward. Orvis Phelps noted the marriage in his ledger of opinions and added that he would not have predicted it, but then, he supposed, that was the nature of things. His wife told him it was not his business, which was the most correct thing she said all winter. Garrett Phelps did not return to Harlan Creek. The spring came soft and early, and Reuben plowed the north pasture on a Tuesday with the mare moving sound and strong beneath the harness, and Grace planted the kitchen garden wider than she had in 2 years, and Thomas found a meadowlark nest in the fence line and guarded it with a severity that made the cat very careful about which way it walked. The shelf Reuben built in the kitchen held 6 jars of preserves. The roof above the sleeping loft held all the rain. The chair sat at the table where it had always been meant to sit, and every evening the 3 of them sat down together, and Grace said what she always said, and Reuben already knew it, and Thomas had never needed to be told. The boy eats first, and then the rest of them, and then there was coffee, and the fire, and the long quiet of a house that had become a home, one small act at a time. There is a particular grace in asking the right question first. Reuben Holt did not ask about the land or the terms or what was in it for him. He asked about a 7-year-old boy who drew birds in the margins of his lessons, and in doing so he told Grace Calloway everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was, before he had done a single thing to prove it. You never know when a stranger on the road is going to be the answer to a prayer you didn't know you'd said out loud. Sometimes love arrives not with grand declarations, but with a cup of coffee held in both hands and a question asked quietly, the way a good man asks a question, because he genuinely wants to know. If this story stayed with you tonight, Leave us a word in the comments about the question you believe a good person should ask first. We'd love to hear what you think. Subscribe and join us for more journeys into the frontier and the hearts of the people who built something worth keeping. Good night. God bless you and everyone you love.